Today, we really have a special privilege of having three outstanding scientists and presenters with us. So I will first give an introduction. I am Kamyar Aram. I am a crop production advisor for the East Bay counties of Contra Costa and Alameda for University of California Cooperative Extension. And this is a collaboration between UC Cooperative Extension and the Contra Costa Resource Conservation District. I'll take a moment to have our co-hosts introduce themselves. Off to Rob. Or maybe we'll let Rob in a minute. How about Ben?
Everyone, welcome. My name is Ben Weiss. I'm the Ag Conservation Manager here at Contra Costa RCD.
Julio?
Buenos dias. My name is Julio Contreras. I'm a Community Education Specialist with UC Cooperative Extension's Urban Ag and Food Systems Program.
Derek? Is Derek with us?
I am. Hi, good morning. My name is Derek Emmons, and I am the Agriculture Conservation Coordinator with the Contra Costa RCD.
And I don't know if Rob, you're there now.
I am. I'm having a little trouble with the Zoom, but hi, good morning. I'm Rob Benetton, Urban Ag Advisor, Cooperative Extension. Thanks.
Great. In a moment, I will introduce our presenters. At the end, we're going to have a question and answer session, and you can really enter your questions in the question and answer, the Q&A box feature of Zoom, which many of you are probably familiar with by now, but you can usually find it by hovering your pointer at the bottom of your screen or by tapping on your phone. It should show up. Of course, feel free to participate in the chat as well, but please put your questions when you can in the Q&A box. So without further ado, let's introduce our presenters. We have Dr. Katherine Jarvis-Shean is an orchard systems advisor for Sacramento, Solano and Yolo Counties up in the Capital Corridor. She covers production research, education, and assistance with almonds, prunes, and walnuts. She also fields questions on citrus, pistachios, olives, and stone fruit. Kat's research projects include experiments on almond, prune, and walnut rootstocks, on fertilizer management, and the effects of warmer temperatures on bloom and harvest timing. She has her doctorate from the Horticulture and Agronomy program at UC Davis. And before that, she got a master's degree in international agriculture development, also at UC Davis. And she actually has her bachelor's in history from Harvard University. We have also Vivian Wauters, who is a postdoc at UC Davis. She is broadly interested in agroecosystem diversification and how research can work in tandem with other forms of knowledge and expertise to build capacity for enhanced multifunctionality in ag systems. Her prior research has focused on intersection of cover crops and soil health in Midwest vegetable rotations. And currently she's working with our next presenter, Amélie, is with growers, researchers, and advisors in nonprofits to develop a set of best management practices for integrating cover crops into almond orchards. Vivian got her doctorate in agronomy and agroecology at the University of Minnesota, and she has master's and bachelor's degrees from UC Berkeley in linguistics. And last and certainly not least, we have Professor Amélie Gaudin, who is Associate Professor of Agroecology in the Department of Plant Sciences at the University of California, Davis. And her research currently focuses on developing and testing sustainable management practices, such as cover crops, for California systems, and to better understand the impacts of agrobiodiversity on crop and soil ecosystems. We can put her website also in the chat. Amélie has her PhD from the University of Guelph in Canada and studied crop sciences also at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. She originally hails from France. So thank you all for joining us. We're very excited to have this team presented webinar, and I know it's going to be dynamic with poll questions, so everybody be ready to respond to polls as well. Without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen and pass it on to the presenters.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introductions, Kamiar, and for Amélie sharing her screen. So today we're going to be talking about cover cropping specifically in orchards. As you heard in the bios, some of us are focusing a lot on almonds, but we're going to try and expand it out from there about different approaches for different goals. So first I want to talk a little bit about just how we're going to go through this. So I'm going to be starting with an introduction of why cover crops in orchards. You've maybe heard some of this before, but just to contextualize why we're considering putting vegetation in between these, the tree rows in alleys. Then Amélie's going to take it away with a case study about some research that she's been leading on cover crops in the almond systems. And then Kat will take it away with key considerations for how to actually do this in the orchard systems. So we're going to start out, like Kamiar said, with a poll, which is what orchard crops do you grow, to give us a little bit of a sense about different orchards crops, because how we actually use cover crops differs depending on what orchards crops we grow. So the poll should have popped up on your screen. If you're on a phone, sometimes it doesn't pop up and you have to click the little poll icon. But I can see that some people are voting. It says it's in progress. So click on as many options as you want. There should be the opportunity to indicate multiple things because many people grow multiple things. So as you're going through, oh, and it looks like we have a repeat of palm fruits and then listed fruits. So pick whichever one you want. So we have most people have voted. So we'll give it a couple more seconds. And I think I will end polling and share the results. So now it should pop up and you can see what everybody in this virtual space is growing. So we do have somebody who grows almonds, a couple who grow walnuts, some other nuts, pears, apples, cherries, peaches, plums. So those all get grouped together because they're harvested off the ground. Grapes, different spacing, different systems, olives again, and then many of you who do not grow some of these and people who don't grow orchard crops. So that helps us to understand where you all are coming from. I'm going to stop sharing these results, and a couple more of those are going to appear in your screen as we go through. So hopefully that keeps everybody engaged. It's kind of fun to hear what people are saying, even in that very, a very like non-interactive way, but we do the best we can in our virtual world. So why cover crops? This comes from the fact that the orchard alley is generally underutilized. So people talk about the orchard floor, right? And about 5% of orchards in California, or almond orchards, this is where my almond bias comes in, have winter cover crop, the majority of which is resident vegetation. And you can see this driving down the highway. A lot of people try and keep those alleys pretty clear, but there is a lot of opportunity to intensify use because of various benefits for increased adaptability with climate variability, and they can be useful for tackling production and sustainability challenges. By putting living cover into the alleyways, you're taking advantage of the mutual benefits that the living roots of cover crops and the soil have on each other to restore soils to a living ecosystem. And what we're mostly going to be talking about is winter post-harvest, which is an ideal time because the trees are mostly dormant in this perennial system. You want to keep your trees healthy. and precipitation water is available to help produce biomass, given that precipitation is really a limitation in these systems. So this concept, of course, is not new. So here we have photos from the archives of UCCE evaluations of cover crops way back in the 1920s and 30s. So you can see in the tagline below the first photo on the left, field peas in a tree pruning plot way back when, and those look like they're up to the person's thigh. And then different roots from various cover crops and how deep they go into the soil. So given that there is this knowledge, up in the right-hand corner, you can see the BIOS for almonds, which is an extensive publication released in the 90s looking at cover crops in almonds with a particular eye towards how it could interact with pest concerns and IPM practices. So the question now is really, how can we successfully implement what we know about cover cropping as a practice into our modern intensive systems? And what are the benefits and trade-offs to consider? And there are a lot of different potential benefits that we can have. So you can tackle multiple production practices that people have in their orchards through a combination of shifts that cover crops precipitate both above and below ground and enhance the ecological interactions in these orchard systems. So cover crops can build up soil health and benefits that are obtained from soil, which can especially be the case with unique and difficult to manage interactions with microbes, which are being increasingly recognized as really important for healthy soil. You can harness the benefits and foster beneficial above ground organisms, including benefits to pollinators, and also reduce pest, insects, and weeds. And so there's really an opportunity to gain more benefit by managing these ecosystem interactions and get benefits through this synergy for your trees and your system. So moving into the case study, before we get started with that, I'm interested from you all, because maybe you've attended some of these other talks or you have experience with cover crops in the past, what the benefits of cover crops are that interest you most. So we have the poll starting. Again, it should pop up. Yep, looks like we got people answering. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to read through all of those. Of course, not all of these are relevant for every orchard crop, but the priority might vary depending on what you grow. I'll give that just a couple more seconds. Okay. So you can see the results here. Soil health really comes up as the top reason, and that's often true of what I've found in cover crop research of why people come to cover cropping and what they're interested in. And so I will now pass it over to Amélie to talk a little bit more about what some recent research that she has led in almonds says about many of these benefits that you see below. So let's move on to the case study. Take it away, Amélie.
Hi, everyone. So yes, I wanted to touch base on a case study in almond system, because this is where we've been doing research over the last 4 years, and share with you some of those results. We've been evaluating cover crop across a rainfall gradient in almond system, going from Glenn County down to Kern County. And I've also been evaluated those cover crops in orchards infested with nematodes at the Parlier field station. Across those different trials, we've been testing 2 popular mixes that have been developed for a different objective, a pollinator mix from Project APIS, and a soil mix that contained brassica, grasses, and legumes that we have custom designed to provide various benefits to soil functions. And we've been comparing those two cover crop mixes to perennial resident vegetation that is mowed frequently and or bare soil. And we've also been trying across those replicated trials on commercial farm to post-bloom termination date early on in March or later in April. And we're grateful to our partners for helping out with those trials, including growers and seed providers. So what have we learned? Well, I think we've been doing this, planting those trials for 3 years now. And what we see is that cover crops are a flexible, feasible practice for almond systems that can be rain-fed. And you see here the extent of the cover we get from north to south just on rainfalls. So it is a practice that can be implemented successfully in almond orchard, and we can get acceptable stand across the valley. Some nuggets of results, and the main results we've been observing so far. The first lies around soil health outcome. So poor aggregation, high compaction, frequently limit water retention and supply in orchard, nutrient cycling, carbon storage, and in general, we tend to be working, especially in almond orchard, with very compacted soils. After 3 years of cover crops, what are our main observations? Well, first, we measured a significant improvement in soil aggregation with vegetative cover, all of the different cover crop mixes, which has some potential benefits that we've measured for water and filtration, and I'll get to that in a few slides, and potentially on dust reduction, but we haven't directly measured this. We see a large impact and a fast impact on soil biology. So soil ecosystems and their living communities respond rather quickly to having those roots in the system and inputs of biomass. It's depending, the effects were not homogeneous across the trial. It was very side, year, and mix dependent. But some general trends that we observed was a significant increase in microbial biomass, so more of those microbes, but also a shift in the soil food web toward more complex food webs enriched in bacterial feeding nematodes, for instance. So a more active soil and an extended soil food ecosystems. Something noteworthy in terms of soil health, we did not observe after 3-year increase in soil carbon, but we do see increases in other soil health properties of relevance to growers across the state. One noteworthy fact is that we see a significant decrease in sodicity, so the SAR, and the sodicity is basically the amount of sodium relative to calcium and magnesium in a water extracts that we take from saturated soil paste. And so soil that have high SAR values of 13 and above may be characterized by greater dispersion of organic matter and clay particles, reduced saturated hydraulic conductivities and aeration, and a general degradation of soil structure. So we see a significant benefits of cover crops when it comes to sodicity. Above ground, we've measured and in collaboration with Neil Williams and Elena Niños, the provision of services through forage resources to bees during and after almond bloom. As you can see on this graph that measure honeybee visits, brassicas are especially visited compared to other species, and achieving blooming synchrony has been a real challenge in our trials, and this is something that we see across the state, and early planting and having thinking about the mowing strategies if you want to provide forage resources for bees is something to consider. We have not measured we have not observed any competition for pollination with almond. On the contrary, I would say we see increases in yield and potential to provide useful habitat to improve bee health. Continuing with above ground organisms, we have Stephen Herring and Brad Hansen have been collaborating with us on this project and measured some impact on weed control. We saw some weed suppression when the cover crop emerges early and is really abundant. So it's about competing against the weed for establishment and resources. So cover crops suppress growth. We see that the weed germination and emergence is not affected, but really having this cover crop cover suppress the growth rather than germination. We see a decrease in weed diversity over time. We do not know the effect on summer weeds quite yet, and this is subject to investigation this year. But in general, early seeding of a mixture ahead of the winter rain is critical. If you want to suppress weed, you need to give an advantage to your cover crop and have an early stand establishment. We have been controlling cover crops with mowing and herbicides and dry conditions. We do not see any potential negative impacts of having some species that might be difficult to control, such as vetch here, on weed suppression or on weed cover. This is something to think about, but not something we've observed in our trials across the state. In terms of pest nematodes, Andrea Vespel has been conducting some greenhouse and field tests of cover crop species. We see that some cover crop species might host an increased nematode population density, so really something to take into account at the time of choosing species and really having this conversation with your seed provider to make sure that you're not planting a species that would increase potentially your nematode problems. But some species can actually limit reproduction of pest nematodes. Most of the plant lines and species we've been testing allowed limited reproduction of root lesion nematode, except for lupine. And radish and sandhemp in particular seem to be very poor hosts for both the root lesion nematode and the root ring nematodes. Cover crop can suppress some root lesion, but do not necessarily suppress root ring nematodes. So it's important to make sure that you choose a species adapted to your objective. We do see a large variability between species, for instance, clover types. And so it's important to take, not take a blanket statement that clover might be good for this or that, but some species of clover, especially rose clover, might be beneficial in limiting the reproduction of some key nematode pests. What's important to think about is that the cover crop roots need to grow near the tree or where the tree roots might be for an extended growth period to harness the benefits. This is in season. I'm not talking about biofumigation here that could be done before orchard establishment using a brassica cover crop, for instance. So Paul here, we're interested in knowing what production concern do you have about cover crop? And by production concern, we mean things that could happen in the orchard that would affect overall production and input use that you might be concerned about. And we've given various options here. So I'm going to let you a few minutes to answer those questions. All right, maybe let's look at the results, please. I don't have control over the polls. So some key results is that excess water use is really a main production concern for many of you. A complicated transition, orchard access, and some other potential impacts. Harvests come up, potential production concerns over facilitating harvest is also high on the radar. So I'm going to address now some of those concerns and share with you what we've learned from research thus far, realizing that we still have a lot of work to do. First, when it comes to water balance, so cover crop can have multiple impacts on elements of water balance. Cover crop transpire water, so they can use water that way, but they can also capture some dew moisture in their canopy. The tree induced a cooler surface temperature along with the cover crop, so a potential lower soil temperature here, which might also help retain water in the soil. Through organic matter improvements, we might see better water retention and an increase in soil water infiltration due to those root structures in the topsoil. In a bare soil, we will have no transpiration from the cover crop, but we still get evaporations from soil that might be higher because of higher soil temperature and a higher potential for runoff and a lower potential for soil water infiltration. I think we see very frequently those benefits just driving across the landscape. This is a picture shared with me by David Dole in 2017, and those are two orchards on both sides of the road. And you can see here the potential of cover crop to really retain and conserve those retail rainfall in the system. Some of those water benefits might also translate during the growth season with in-season capture of irrigation water. Here you see water ponding, things that we see frequently in orchard that comes from highly compacted soils and loss of soils and water through runoff here. So in terms of water infiltration, those are results 2 years after cover crop. We did measure water infiltration using the gold standard. So it's a dual held infiltrometer. Doing those measurements in orchards are very difficult because we're often dealing with very compacted soil. Nevertheless, a student in my lab, Cynthia Cressy, was able to measure infiltration. And here you can see infiltration in centimeter per seconds of water and a difference between resident across 3 different sites. Here you see in gray is the bare soil or resident vegetation, and in black is one of the cover crop mixes. And we do observe large improvement really early, as soon as 2 years after cover crop implementation across most of those orchards. So really a potential benefit to improve infiltration, especially during the cover crop growth when roots are in the systems. That will lead to a higher capacity of winter rainfall to penetrate the soil, reducing risk of runoff and helping conserve water and potentially recharge our groundwater. Interestingly, some of those conditions tend to revert back to original infiltration rates post cover crop, but the reduce in pooling of irrigation water is noticeable. So we're aiming for long-term improvements here. Water infiltration is one element of water balance. It's important to take into account the evapotranspirative demand of the cover crop. We have some nuggets of data about the use of cover crop, the water use of cover crop, but we're now setting up some with COSANA in Land, Air, and Water Resources, a biometeorologist. We're setting up some new trials here to really quantify all aspects of water balance as impacted by cover crop. But it's important to think about keeping irrigation water use low. Although you might need irrigation at the beginning to have a good stand, if you have the opportunity to do so in micro sprinklers or other type of irrigation system that are not drip, it's important to seed ahead of the first rain to maximize the use of this rainfall. We see no direct competition for water when the cover crop is not growing on the berm. We have measured in collaboration with Sam Sandoval-Sovilis, Alisa De Vincentis, and Jeff Mitchell, No significant differences in soil moisture or tree water status as measured by stem water potential in the spring, and very close evapotranspirative values of winter cover crop and burr soil. Now, we haven't done this overall water balance, so we still need to factor in water retention to have a better understanding of water use efficiencies, especially considering reduction in runoffs as well. Another production concern in some part of the states is the potential increase in frost risk potential with cover crop. There might be a trade-off in that cover crop can reduce overnight soil to tree heat transfer and therefore increase damage risk during sensitive frost nights. We've measured this a couple of years ago, and I just wanted to keep in mind that this is a one season measurements that we haven't repeated, but we've measured temperature at the topsoil, 2 inches above ground, 3 feet above ground, and 5 feet above ground in resident vegetation, mowed resident vegetation, or cover cropped alleyways. What did we find is that if we look at the topsoil temperature, they were cooler under the cover crop, undeniably. But we observed no ambient air temperature differences at 3 and 5 feet where the buds are. So cover cropped orchard may not experience higher frost risk, but could keep soil cooler. It's important to mow and still irrigate for frost control. It can be done anytime, but we do not observe a potential increase in risk in frost risk with cover crop. And it might be interesting to consider a low growing cover such as clover to reduce potential risks. How about profitability? We have been, so the data we've acquired over the last few years have been integrated along with other knowledge into a cover crop calculator. I put here the link, and this is the reference publication from the team that looks at cost-benefit analysis to really look at the impact of cover cropping on profitability. Here you see a breakdown of the cost and benefits. Not everything is in there, and it's hard to put a price tag on increased soil organic matter. But when we ran those models, we see that here you can see the benefits to cost ratio, and including all of those factors, you might start to see an increase in profitability year 7 or so. Finishing with one of the biggest concerns that were expressed is harvest condition and keeping soil clean to facilitate a harvest. This is a picture of harvest condition at our sites. So we haven't had any trouble with keeping good conditions for harvesting nuts, so it is possible. It's important to choose the right species, have a balanced carbon to nitrogen ratio. Legume in general would decompose more quickly, so probably an easier entry point sometimes if this is of a main concern. What is very important is to terminate promptly post-bloom using one or various mowing and or herbicides. All of those technologies are effective if done early to guarantee good harvest conditions. I think there will be new opportunity with off-ground harvest in the near future, so that might not be a perennial concern, but for now, definitely a production aspect that is important to talk about. We've seen no negative impacts on yields. Actually, we've seen a trend toward yield increase in almond in very compacted soils, around 200 to 300 pounds per acre. So some real benefits here for the tree and the systems as well. With that, I will let Kat talk about some key considerations for cover cropping orchards and open the discussion to more orchard systems.
Great, thank you, Amélie, and thank you, Vivian. So we're going to shift into this general talk about the benefits of cover crops and some of the specifics about what research, the hard numbers research shows, into the rubber meets the road sort of stage of how to get this done. and I want to say I'm seeing some stuff coming up on the chat and the Q&A, and just be clear that I'll be talking for another 8 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time to do that question and answer. But hopefully some of this stuff will address what you're asking. So why don't we start with another question here. So Amélie asked about production, but what are some of your management concerns that you have with cover crops? So problems that you are worried about when it comes to how to deal with having a new cover crop or having a cover crop in your orchard. Can we launch the poll here? Great. All right, so having more difficulty at harvest because of residue, difficulty with terminating the crop, managing your stand, getting the right seeding equipment, getting access to your orchard, or other or none. And I guess if Camiar's on the polls, or Vivian, when you see things start to slow down in terms of responses, go ahead and close it.
Just a moment more. I think we're almost all in.
All right. Flying blind here, so I'll trust you. Okay, great. So yeah, so I'm seeing that seeding equipment and harvest are the two biggest concerns. Some concern with managing the stand, termination, and getting access to the orchard. So thanks for that. We'll try to talk about that a little in the midst of this. So when we think about actually implementing cover crops in an orchard, there are specific things about each orchard site, including your crop, your soil, your local climate conditions, that will influence what you plant, the species that you select, where you plant it. So if you're in every row, every other row, how wide the spacing in that row is. And then when you do things, so like when you plant, when you terminate, and how you go about doing that. So let's dig into that. So starting with what you plant, different species are better adapted at accomplishing different goals. You've heard Amélie and Krista talk about the variety of things that cover crops can accomplish, improving soil health. A lot of you said that was your key to top of mind, but also water infiltration, water balance. A lot of you responded that plant nutrition is, improving nutrition is important to you, pollinator health and weed coverage. So different different species can accomplish this in different ways. What you see on your upper right here is a little chart that sort of roughly breaks this down, which you can find at a website that we can send out to in a follow-up email after this. But I like to roughly break things into grasses, legumes, and brassicas when it comes to species. So legumes are great at providing nitrogen. Grasses, because they have a real a webby network of roots, are great at scavenging nitrogen and holding on to it through the winter so that it can be made available in the system again the following spring. Grasses, because of that webby root network, and brassicas, because of their deep tap root network, are good at increasing infiltration. Pollinizers, as you've heard Amélie say, the brassicas are really the best for bees. And then legumes, also having some flowering, is good for bees after almond bloom, or if you're not in almonds, in other bloom windows. All of them are good at suppressing weeds, or can be if done right, and all of them can increase soil health in their own way. But the next thing to keep in mind is that we often work in mixtures. So there's not one species that's going to be the best cover crop for you. As you can see with this little image collection figure down here on the left at the bottom, cover crop species composition is, and what you end up having in your orchard when you get into the spring relates to both the species you selected, but also the environment, the climate, the soil you're planting it into, the canopy cover of your trees, and your management. So you can see some pictures here at the bottom of that same soil mix. On the left, same seed mix, very different outcomes in different sites. And again, and then on the right, pollinator mix, same mix, different outcomes. So we like a blend of different species to hedge our bets when it comes to making sure that we have a good stand where we're planting. So yeah, you might plant the same mix year in and year out and get a different stand every year. So just to sort of give you an idea of what we're talking about when we say different species selections and a visual on that, on the left you see here in a vineyard setting, a crimson clover cover crop with some grasses mixed in to really target that nitrogen soil fertility. And on the right, excuse me, a perennial grass cover in vineyards to facilitate orchard, that's all I think about, vineyard access. So, you know, at the top of the talk, a lot of you guys responded. It seemed like about a third of you are in nut cropping systems. So you're concerned about having a clean floor at harvest, but about 2/3 of you are not in nut cropping systems, are in fruit cropping systems. And so you don't need to be as worried about having an immaculate dirt-only floor at harvest. And you might be even interested in a perennial sod, especially if you're in a U-pick sort of system, to have a nice lawn for people to wander in on throughout the season. Next. All right, so that's what we're planting. When we think about where to plant it, this is especially pertinent when it comes to orchard access and this sort of concern, and a little bit especially with almonds, well, with any of the nut crops when it comes to navel orangeworm management concern. So there's a lot of concern about being sure that you can get in to prune and shape your trees, to get mummy nuts out of the trees, and to be able to shred those mummies in the late winter, so in the sort of January, March timeframe. So certainly every row is a feasible option, and you might get your pants a little wet having brassicas up to your waist, but you can get in there. Another alternate strategy is planting every other row. So you can have a working row in which you could drive a shredder, in which you could blow your mummies over into that row. People could get in with ladders up and down that row. You know, I think in a Sac Valley context, often the unplanted row is not actually the one that's the easiest to get in on because of the rainfall that we have in the winters. I think that alternate row strategy makes maybe more sense in a Southern Valley context. Offset planting timing is another approach to this. I think this makes a lot of sense if you have a lot of acreage. So you could plant a little later in one row and then earlier in the other. So you have a low growing cover in one row and a cover that's higher growing and farther ahead in the other. If you're renting the equipment to do the seeding, this probably won't be an option for you. And finally, thinking about just getting a low growing cover. So if you're worried about orchard access, waist high brassica is probably not the answer for you, but something like clovers or even low growing grasses might be more up your alley, up your orchard alley, let's say. Next. So this is just a visual of that, how you can have, so that's, you know, the planting in terms of by row, but also think about that you can vary the width of the strip that you are planting. And so that's another way to get around this issue of being able to get into the orchard having a very high cover crop. So you can see different approaches to that here, a very narrow strip or just wall-to-wall cover crop. But keep in mind, when you think about this approach, you'll also need to mow this eventually. So you want to be sure that you have the right equipment to manage it at the end of the timing when it comes to termination. Next. All right, so that's the what and the how. When we think about the when, this depends on a lot of things. So, you know, we're going through our summer. Our trees have leaves on them, we're picking our crop off of them. Harvest, depending on what you're growing, could harvest anywhere from early summer into October, November. But it's better to get your seed in when there's not going to be a lot more traffic subsequent to getting that seed down. So The earlier you get your seed in, the more likely you are to get early flowering to target those bees, and the more time you'll have for biomass accumulation. The later you get it in, the more likely you are to probably have rainfall to help you get it up. So if you're on a drip irrigated system, a later planting, later seeding is probably going to work out better for you. Okay, and then we get into when to terminate. So thinking about, do you harvest your crop from the ground or from the trees? Do you want to leave flowers for pollinators until a particular time, depending on the pollinator you're thinking about, bees or natives? And what's the maximum nitrogen contribution if you're really using this as a tool in your fertility management? So if you're harvesting off the ground, earlier termination. If you want flowers for pollinators, well, the pollinator timing will influence when you terminate. And knowing that for nitrogen, you want to terminate when the legumes are about 50% flowering. So let's play through some other termination timing scenarios here. If you terminate on the earlier side, say in February to mid-March, the benefit of this is you really start that cover crop residue breaking down early. You can get in there with your mowing, and that will also destroy mummy nuts for navel orangewort concern. At the same time, you're doing that shredding. Your cover crop will have a low seed-N ratio. And you'll mitigate that frost risk as much as possible. But the trade-off then is you have less biomass accumulation, you still have some winter rains, so you might not be optimizing that benefit of rain capture. If you're not talking about the brassicas, your flowers might not have flowered yet. So that limits your forage. So that's our early timing scenario. When we think about mid-termination timing, you know, you're getting more biomass by using that approach. You can terminate before you need to start fertigating. So your cover crop isn't getting the nutrients out of the soil that you're intending for your trees. It facilitates other orchard operations like spraying. But again, we have some trade-offs with this. You don't get your full nitrogen benefit if that's one of your key goals. You're limiting forage. And as we move into this later timing, some of the woodier, potentially woodier stuff might have more trouble breaking down in this timing, especially on the April end of things. And then when we think about, oh, that should say late. So late May or June, you know, this is really you're maxing out your biomass. You might even have set seed, so you won't need to reseed as much, which could be good or bad if you're really into controlling what's growing in your orchard. You've got ample timing for flowering and for bee foraging. You might get less nitrogen benefit if the nitrogen is moved into the seeds of your legumes and out of the root system. The biomass can be pretty unruly at this point and pretty woody, which will give you difficulty breaking down. So here's just some sort of thinking through how to actually do this. We have flail mowers or rotary motors. We have roller crimpers, which really just sort of break it off right at the soil, but leave the whole long stem. And we have herbicides, which we can use before or after mowing to aid the breakdown and termination process. Another option, which is more of an option in fruit systems, is thinking about sheep or even chickens. I would say cows are too big to be in most orchard systems, and goats are very good at climbing things, including trees. So I would stay away from those two options. This comes with a lot more considerations about the thing that comes out the back end of these animals and making sure that that's safe in terms of your food safety. So talk with your processor about this if you have a processor or a distributor, but generally speaking, removing 90 days before harvest if you're just picking straight from the tree, or 120 days if you're picking off the ground. Okay, and so here's just a little, some visuals to show. This is a 6 to 10 foot strip planted with a no-till drill in the end of November. Didn't get a lot of water, had some, a little micro sprinkler. This was terminated in late March. This was mulched after mowing and got some herbicide. And you can see the soil condition, excuse me, the surface conditions here at harvest. No need for conditioner, easy harvest. So to just really sum up, you know, getting this done in a way that fits in with your management system really starts with planning ahead and starting small. And I would say I'm a pretty conservative person, so you know, follow the recipe that is most likely to be successful, probably more leaning on the legume side for and terminating earlier. And once that works out for you, you can sort of push the envelope a little bit more with different species and a later termination. And scaling up, you know, as resources are available. Find fellow growers, crop advisors in your areas or researchers. Or the RCD folks are great for this, NRCS folks are great for this, whose brain you can pick about what has worked really well in your area. And adjust and go from there. So I think there's a lot of, you know, it's just me and Amélie and Vivian on the call, but there's a lot of brain power that went into this presentation and a lot of people working really hard on this, including a lot of funders and supporters. And lastly, we want to know how helpful this was to you. So the last couple of poll questions are to help us gauge whether this was beneficial. If we could launch that first one. If you could rate your knowledge level regarding cover crop use before and after this presentation. So it's a two-part question. In terms of no knowledge, some, fairly knowledgeable, very knowledgeable, extremely knowledgeable, in both the before and after time frame.
And the third question is also on this same.
Oh, the third question is also on here. Okay, great.
Yep.
And then the third question is, if you could indicate your intention to use any of this information that was presented today. You'll definitely use it. You'll probably use it. You're undecided. You probably won't use it, or you definitely won't use it. That'd be very helpful for us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, is that starting to peter out in terms of responses?
We're gonna leave it open a little bit.
Okay,
folks
great.
continue to.
Sure. Yeah, and I guess we could just launch into the Q&A even while that's still up, huh?
We might, depending on how I can manage my screen, but but let me actually, I'm gonna just throw a question out for you all, because I think it's a question that's not in the Q&A, but I think often comes up in orchard situations. And that is, why would I not just let the volunteer vegetation do the thing, you know, in certain circumstances, you know? What are some of the...
I think that's a super fair question. I mean, you know, if you look back at Amélie's slide that showed the infiltration rates, the one that had resident vegetation in the north had the infiltration was just as high as the cover crop. And so if that's your concern, if that's your vegetation in your middle's goal is infiltration, well, then that could do just fine. You're not going to get nitrogen from resident vegetation. You're not going to get nematode control from resident vegetation. So that'd be my first quick answer, is it really depends on your goals, and resident vegetation might check that box or it might not. But I'll let Amélie and Vivian, if you have other thoughts.
No, that's right, Katherine.
And we've got the poll results up. I don't know if you want to
Great.
look and make comments.
Okay. Are you able to save these results, Kamiar?
Yes, we will.
Okay. All right. Well then, yeah, that's just for our knowledge afterwards. So,
great. So,
all right. And I know we're at the noon hour. I'm happy to stay on and answer questions.
So we will be launching into question and answer. We have several questions in the box, and so please do feel free to continue to add them in there. I wanted to say thank you to all our presenters, Vivian, Amélie, and Katherine, for really such a deep and informative presentation. We have a video of this that we will post later, and I will certainly want to see it again, just because I know I wouldn't have caught everything this time around. So please look for that link to be sent to you, and it's also going to be on my YouTube channel, the East Bay Crop Production YouTube channel. Also, so many credits and references in this presentation, and as Katherine pointed out at the end, so much great work being done in the state here. We also have another evaluation that will open up, or at least you'll be prompted to open up when you leave the presentation. So please do fill out the evaluation. It really helps us justify the work we do, and also to make sure we're bringing to you the most relevant and useful educational programming. So with that, let's launch into some questions. First up, we have a question about specific cover crops for citrus orchards. Now we're all kind of in the north here, but we have attendants from all over the state, I know. Any comments? Anyone want to take that?
Yeah, I can take the first crack. I would say that, you know, with citrus, because you're picking from, you know, straight out of the tree, you don't have to worry about a clean floor in the same way. And so I think then it depends on your water availability, your water balance. You actually have more options in terms of, I mean, everything we've talked about here has been about winter cover crops. You could even have something growing in the middle during the summer in a citrus orchard if you weren't worried about water use as much. But because you need to get in there to pick in the winter, I would say some grasses that you might be able to mow, or a clover, low-growing clover type base. If you're, I think sometimes the clovers can be a little viney, which I would find annoying trying to move my orchard ladder around. That's the only reason that I might suggest a grass, or like a grass clover mix would be good too. Yeah, any others?
Certainly. And there was another question by Christina also about Phytophthora in citrus specifically, but how about just the effect on Phytophthora or maybe any other fungal pathogens? You addressed nematodes and insect pests.
So I'll take first crack, and then I would love Amélie to jump in if she has more to add. I mean, I think the biggest benefit that we can definitely say that you get from cover crops with regards to Phytophthora is better water infiltration and with your soils. So the more that there's standing water in the soil, in the root zone, the more that encourages Phytophthora to thrive and infect your roots. So to get that benefit, it's kind of like Amélie said, you need the cover crop to be growing where the tree roots are, so that you have that benefit of water infiltration. So you probably want a wider planting of your cover crop. And I think it's less well documented, but stands to reason a bit, that the more good microbes, the more microbe activity that you have in your soil, the less you have this vacuum in which one pathogen can sort of take off. Amélie, you want to jump on that?
Thanks, Kat. The literature is not definitive about this as far as I know. Direct effects of microbial communities on this fungal disease haven't been shown, but definitely some indirect effects through shifts in water movements can be very important.
Thank you. So while we're on the topic, just real quick, we also do have some olive growers in our area, and I know throughout California. Just in terms of olives being a little bit different in terms of how they're cultivated, any special considerations that you might suggest for olives, or basically similar approaches?
I would say, you know, I would think of olives in some ways when it comes to cover crops is similar to vineyards and fruit in that you don't need to worry about the clean orchard floor as much. And so, because you're picking it straight out of the tree. Yeah, you might not need to rely on getting quite as much nitrogen. So that kind of opens up a lot of possibilities for you.
Super.
One
Thank you.
additional comment about the like specifics to olives is that there's many growers who have various different crops, and a lot of people who use cover crops will try and find a mix that kind of balances a lot of the benefits, because it's one thing to think about a cover crop for a specific orchard, but then to have to think about 3 different cover crop mixes planted in 3 different ways and managed 3 different ways, 4 different systems can make it even more overwhelming. So there's a benefit to specializing based on the opportunities in a specific orchard type. But if you're managing multiple types, many growers will find something that kind of works across the board, and that can alleviate some of that pressure to like maximize exactly in a specific orchard context.
Yeah, that's a great point. Optimizing for your whole farming operation is not always the same as optimizing for each block. Yeah.
Super. Our next question was on almonds, and I think you really addressed this in the presentation. So about, let's see what it was. Yeah, about unwanted kind of floor cover at the harvest time. So let's go ahead and move from that on. Is there anything else? I think we covered that pretty well, right?
Yeah, I think I would start from an earlier time frame of March, and as you get comfortable with it, move from there. Maybe push the envelope a little bit.
Right. The question here about increasing cover crop establishment using broadcast seeding as opposed to drilling. Any suggestions?
Oh, yeah. So that's a great question. Well, I don't know, Vivian or Amélie?
Vivian, maybe, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so depending on your seeding method and what tools you have available, you will get some differences. So if you're using a broadcast seeder, it can be effective. We've had growers use that, but you do need to prep your alley beforehand, because otherwise you may have a very compacted floor. You throw all your seeds on the surface and then the birds love it, but that's about it. So making sure that you take proper care to make sure that you get good seed to soil contact is really critical. And that will definitely affect germination, but just as important is making sure that water is getting to those seeds. So you can have good seed to soil contact, but if no water gets to the seeds, then they're also not going to germinate. So finding that balance of making sure that you get good seed to soil contact, and then water is going to give you the best chance for good germination.
Thank you. Our next question asks, or just asks for a general comment on the support the cover crops might give for arbuscular and mycorrhizal fungi. There's a second part, whether you can kind of do practices of growing actually mushroom producing fungi as a kind of alternate crop, alternate harvest as well. So those are 2 separate things, but in the same question.
Well, I can speak to the first part of this question. I don't think I can answer the second part, but the first part, we've looked into this a little bit in almond system. We've surveyed 25 orchards across the state, across different management practices, and looked at colonization of tree roots by AMF. We found across those 25 orchards that one inoculation, first we find AMF everywhere. Around 70% of the roots are colonized. So there's some dogma around that almond roots are not colonized by AMF, and this is not true. Second point is that the most influential practices in terms of boosting AMF colonization was having living roots in the system as long as possible. So compost only was not enough to improve colonization. inoculation did not translate into higher higher colonization rates later in development. So cover crops was the most instrumental practice in increasing root colonization by AMF. We saw differences between rootstocks. And on top of my head, I don't remember which rootstock was the mostly colonized, but I'm happy to share the scientific publication with you. In general, we found more AMF in organically managed almond orchards. And fumigation did not have an impact. 2 years after fumigation, basically those AMFs are back, and we do not see differences between fumigated or biofumigated or non-fumigated orchards.
Wonderful. So that's really great to hear. And I would only make a comment about the second question of growing mushrooms. You know, I'm definitely having the impression that growing cover crops is as much, if not more so, an art than a pure science. And definitely growing mushrooms is also an art. So I think that's an exciting, but you know, that's going to be quite a project. So if you can make it work, we'd love to hear about it. So our next question, Jessica asks, are there any research on perennial ground covers or low growing perennials such as Phylla nodiflora or Trifolium fragiferum? I think that's strawberry. So any comments on perennial ground cover, especially ones that grows low, and also, well, we'll ask the next question second, so let's comment on that.
I mean, yeah, I think in some ways the grasses and the nutrient competition ties in a little bit with that as well. I mean, so the short answer is yes, there's plenty of research on it, but I don't think any of the folks on the call have done much of that research because we're mostly working in, you know, the big acreage systems that need a clean floor at harvest. So there is a lot of there are a lot of resources available for folks who are interested in perennial ground cover, but I'm not as well versed in that literature. I would say that certainly that ground cover will be using water and nutrients throughout the season, and a lot more of it than it would in the winter because there's just higher temperatures, more transpiration. So that's something to keep in mind, not something to say that you can't do it. And it will be using some nutrients, whether it's grass or any other sort of cover during the growing season. Again, that's not to say that's a reason not to do it, but just something to integrate into your management.
One additional comment on that, for when you use perennial covers, some of the growers that we've talked to who use some perennial species, sometimes by accident, like a grower who had a bunch of clover in their almond orchard and really likes it as a perennial clover because the system's on drip. And so that clover kind of disappears during the summer. So you may have really different experiences with perennial cover crops depending on how water gets to the cover crop and how much water you get during the season. So this is a place where I think looking at the research that exists depending on what orchard crop you're growing, and then also looking for orchards where there is that type of material growing in the field, and then asking the person who's experienced with it how they manage it, because I think there's so many nuances that can come there depending on your irrigation system, where you're at, what you're harvesting from as well. So call on the expertise of others.
That's a great point. Yeah, you know, so UC probably doesn't have a lot of resources on this because we're so worried about winter water use, or excuse me, summer water use. But NRCS, being a nationwide organization, has more resources on summer cover crops. You might also look at extension materials out of the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, because they want to cover in their orchards so that they can get access even though it rains in the summer there. But as Vivian said, you'll need to keep in mind that they have that summer rainfall to help them with irrigation or to help them grow that crop. So keep that in mind. And you might not if you're on drip or micro.
Great perspectives. Thank you. Next question is, why is the tipping point for profitability at 7 years?
You want to
So that was in Amelie's
either of you?
presentation.
Yeah, so this calculator, let me just put the link to the calculator in the chat if you want to look at it as we're talking here. But it greatly depends of the assumptions and parameter you put in this calculator. So you will see you have basic information. So, you know, what are your projected harvests? In terms of cost, those will not really change. I think what makes the most difference when coming to this year 7 is the shifts in soil carbon and soil health. And when you start putting a price tag on potential water savings and carbon markets, that makes the calculator tip a little bit, including you know, fertilizer savings, etc. So it just takes into account that the data that shows that it's a medium-term strategy into harnessing some of those benefits. So it starts really popping up when you start to put a dollar value on it later. But I think you can potentially envision earlier benefits, just because this calculator does not encompass all of the potential benefits that you might get.
Yeah, and I mean, it's, you know, it's built to be one calculator for 1.2 million acres of almonds, right? So there's going to be, and I think also not just what benefits you're trying to put a dollar value on, but what your starting baseline is also has a big impact on that turnaround return on investment. So if you're dealing with some really degraded soils, having a lot of problems with water infiltration, that sort of thing, you're going to see a much quicker turnaround.
That's right. I think that's something that came out of our research, in that in many almond orchards down south, soil health is actually limiting in terms of yield. And 1 year after cover crop in very compacted orchard, you see this boom, you know, 200 pounds per acre of additional almond. And so that can factor in pretty quickly, and it's not really in this calculator quite yet.
Great, and I'm going to interject a question that I think is very relevant that I had, which is, you know, this has been a very dry year, and I've seen cover crops have struggled to get established in some places. And just thinking about as possibly we might be looking at drier years to come, that balance between having a difficult time of establishing cover crop, but also knowing that cover crops aid in capturing what water there is and better infiltration and retention. Can you make some comments about what climate changes might implicate and changes in water availability for kind of cover cropping in the future?
I would say that the precipitation future picture is one of the cloudiest, most difficult to determine. But right now the projection is that on average, the amount of water that will be falling from the sky will not change that much. What may change is the intensity of the deluge, whether it's falling as water or snow in different parts of the state. And so from my perspective, especially in the Sac Valley, I think more important to optimize the ability to capture that water when it does fall. If you have a petite stand 1 year that we haven't gotten quite as much cover, you're still getting the benefit of that water infiltration. You're not getting as much biomass, but you're getting a lot of other benefits. So just because it's not as high as an elephant's eye by March doesn't mean that you're not getting benefits out of it.
Wonderful, thank you. The next question.
Amélie or Vivian, did you have anything to add to that? I kind of jumped in. Okay.
Great, thank you, Kat. The next question, I'm not completely sure how to interpret, so I will read it to you and maybe you will have a better shot, but it's succession of pioneer weeds for the season and location might not provide the hoped for results, is a question. I suppose we're getting at, well, let's interpret this as kind of what might be the interaction between weeds over a number of years in cover cropping based on seasonal differences. We're talking about drier years. That's the, I don't know. Perhaps, Teresa, you can.
Yeah, Teresa, I'm wondering if maybe what Teresa is talking about is that resident vegetation versus a planted cover crop. And so if you have resident vegetation, like Kat was saying, it could be really great, especially some of the growers up in the Sac Valley, where there's some growers will talk about like really lush, like nice vegetation, or people will talk about really problematic or pernicious weeds that are a major problem. And so it really depends on your goals, how you think about weeds. So there's a standard view of all things that are growing that you don't want, those are all your weeds, but recognizing when there's weeds that might not be such a problem once you are managing your orchard with an eye towards some of the benefits that having more vegetation in the crop can grow. We visited some cover crops recently that they were about 60% fillery over the entire orchard. But fillery for this grower is not really an issue. It's pretty low growing. It's not posing many problems. It dries up. It's not using a ton of water. And so for that grower, that is providing the hoped for results of having roots in the system and infiltration. But like the question says about the succession of weeds, growing in your orchard may end up not providing the results that you wanted. And so resident vegetation is inherently a less controlled version of increasing vegetation in your operation than choosing species. But then you could also have weeds that are growing with your cover crop. And so that's definitely part of the learning process and part of the cost benefit calculation of what kinds of things you're planting versus letting grow.
Thank you, Vivian. Very nicely intuited the meaning of that. Appreciate that. If not any more comment on that, we'll move on to Ron's question. Any particular recommendation for mowing versus tilling for cover crops? I know it often depends. Again, different approaches for different goals, right?
Yeah, different approaches for different goals. I would say the soil health benefits are largely, you don't really optimize those if you till in your cover crop, because that really activates a lot of munching microbes that and that carbon just goes up in smoke. So you're not, and improving soil tilth and that sort of thing. But if you're looking for getting all of the nitrogen in from your cover crop, if that's what you're really trying to optimize, if you're looking for nematocidal benefits of particular brassicas, if that's what you're trying to optimize, then tilling in would be the better path for you. But I think for most of the benefits that we're talking about in improving water infiltration, soil health, that's the mowing is the better option. Amélie or Vivian?
Fantastic. So another question from Jessica about, I think the question is really about specific cover crops that might especially contribute to organic matter buildup and carbon sequestration.
So that's a tricky question because, I mean, I hate to be the best kid. I always say it depends, but it does. But so what are the premise of carbon sequestration and organic matter accrual? You need a variety of type of organic matter inputs in your system. You need high amount of biomass above ground, but also below ground to have those carbon input in the system. You need good aggregation. The carbon that is sequestered in soil is actually a carbon that is landed through microbes. So the necromass of the microbes is what is preferentially sequestered. So you need soil biological activity, and a diverse microbial community has been shown to trigger potentially larger amount of soil organic matter storage. So, and there's of course a distinction between sequestration over the long term versus just having those active fractions. So I think the best bet is probably to have a mixture of species that has a balanced carbon to nitrogen ratio, so that you keep those concerns about fertility in mind as well, with nitrogen and carbon being released together, because microbes need both of them to be able to cycle this carbon through the soil ecosystem and leading to soil organic matter accrual. So I would say a diversity of root structure, good stand, and a mixture with a balanced carbon to nitrogen ratio would be potentially the most beneficial. What we see when it comes down to carbon sequestration in particular is that synergies with compost are especially effective. So if you have compost and cover crop, what happened is that compost, the carbon in compost get into a dissolved organic carbon fraction, and those roots of the cover crop provide preferential channel to move this carbon at depth. And this is where it stays and is captured. And so if you look at some long-term trials we've been implemented in annual, very till disturbed systems, the only way to increase soil organic matter in those systems is to have both of those practices at the same time.
Super, thank you very much. I'm going to kind of piggyback on that and just ask, do you have any experience with growers ever using fertilizers other than compost, whether organic or synthetic, to kind of manage the nitrogen issues around cover crop management, like whether they possibly tie up nitrogen, or just to help the cover crop break down better?
So I haven't seen this in almond system, because really the nitrogen benefits of cover crop are not high on the radar. And in some ways you will need to blow the residue under the tree to get the full nitrogen benefits. But Vivian and Kat, maybe in other system or in almond systems, there's some other things we can develop here.
Sorry, to be quite honest, I was reading something in the chat, so I missed the question.
You were not listening? Busted.
Awesome.
So I was just asking whether you know of any growers who actually apply fertilizers, whether organic or synthetic, in any part of their cover cropping practice, whether it's to feed the crop, the cover crop itself, or to help it break down in the spring, or to compensate for any nitrogen that may be tied up with incorporation.
I mean, I think plenty of the organic guys are relying on a real buckshot approach to their nutrient management, and so so they're putting down compost, and they have a nitrogen-oriented cover crop, but that's not necessarily to feed their cover crop. Certainly, I was working with a grower who really wanted to push the envelope with terminating late, and that didn't work out perfectly, and so he tried applying some nitrogen on top of the detritus in the alleys to see if that would help break it down. But that's just one experience, and it didn't work out that great. But we didn't have a control to compare against. So yeah, so not really, I guess is the short answer.
Yeah, just a curious point, but thank you for sharing the experience you've had with that. Teresa did clarify the question earlier, and I think highlights that Vivian, you intuited correctly there. Thank you. And then final question, do grasses hold more carbon than legumes like clover and vetch in the soil over multiple years?
I'm unsure about this. I don't think we have the long-term data to be definitive about the impact of grasses versus legumes on soil organic matter or carbon. It's a lot of function of the biomass and the growth and the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So I'm not sure if it's really a function of species per se, although root traits are important, but they vary even within broad species categories. So yeah, I don't know. Vivian, do you want to add something to this? I haven't seen any research around those questions in our specific irrigated semi-arid climates systems.
Well, thank you. Really thank you to our three presenters, Vivian Wauters, Amélie Gaudin, and Katherine Jarvis-Shean for this really informative presentation and question and answer session. Really appreciate you doing this great teamwork on this topic for us. We're about at the end of our time. I just want to take a moment to say, yes, please, again, look out for that evaluation survey that you'll be prompted to open as you exit. And also we have a few more webinars left in the series for you coming up this spring, including one that will address cost share opportunities. Ben, I think we're still waiting for clarification on healthy soils.
Yeah, it looks like it's coming back, but we don't have anything in writing, or should I say in the budget yet. So as soon as we know more information, we'll get that out there. And yeah, I would expect that probably late April, early May.
Thank you. And we'll have another webinar on cover cropping on urban farms on a smaller scale coming up on Saturday, the 27th of March. So if you're interested in that topic, please definitely check out our webpage and look out for our mailings on that. With that, thanks everyone for joining us today, and thank our speakers again, and thank my co-hosts, and hope to see you again soon. Have a great day.